hands up. All right, well, let's get started today. I'm going to do what I've been doing here the last several weeks and start with just a couple of things out of the news before we turn our attention to Lesson 13. So there's two things I'll mention. One of them just came out yesterday, and I don't know, it's so ironic that I guess it's worth mentioning. Some of you might have seen this, but we've mentioned a couple of times the University of Pennsylvania swimmer, and it's a biological male swimming with the women's swim team, setting all kinds of NCAA records, Ivy League school, very prestigious. The NCAA and the university are very supportive of him, even though members of the swim team, women, have anonymously come out as very opposed and understandably, justifiably upset over what's happening. So yesterday, there was an article where he lost a race. He won several in this meet, but he lost one race. But what was so ironic is that he lost to a transgender, but it is a woman transitioning to man. So it's a biological male swimming as a female, and now we've got a biological female who's transitioning to male, and so she beat him in one race. And that's part of the irony too. She's had a double mastectomy, so she's begun the process of physical change, but is not taking testosterone because if she did, she would not qualify to swim as a woman. And there's an irony in that as well. Do you see the irony in that? She doesn't want to swim against Division I men because she knows she couldn't compete. And so in the article that I read, they got a couple of comments from her, and she was saying that, things like, this is a very, very loose paraphrase, most of what I'm going to tell you, but, I'm in the wrong body, but I continue to put on the women's swimsuit because I want to compete as a Division I swimmer. And so I'm going to continue to do this even though it's like disturbing for her and psychologically difficult to put on what she calls the wrong swimsuit. But she's doing that because she recognizes that if she went on testosterone and tried to swim against the men, that she wouldn't have a chance. And so, yes, I had so many responses to this as I was reading it. One of my responses it's a genuine response. It's what I felt. There wasn't a picture of her, but I can imagine that she is a Division I swimmer, which she probably is very in shape and physically a nice-looking woman, wouldn't you? I just would imagine that. And so when I hear she's had a double mastectomy and she's done that, just to become a man, you just think that is so sad, isn't it? Everything about that story is just so sad. And again, as we talked about this months ago, from a more psychological perspective, transgenderism, the best analogy that I am aware of, and I read this in Ryan Anderson's book, which was banned by Amazon. You might remember this a year ago or so. The book was banned because the book is so rigorous, academically speaking, that it's such a threat to the transgender community that instead of trying to deal with it honestly, they just use their power to get it banned. But in that book, Ryan Anderson says, when you think about transgenderism, the best analogy to think about would be something like anorexia. You all know what anorexia is, right? It's an eating disorder. And what's that based in? When the anorexic looks in the mirror, what does normally she? What's that? Yeah, so the anorexic, let's just imagine it's a young woman and she should weigh 130 pounds if she were at a healthy weight, and instead she weighs 90 pounds or 85 pounds. So she is rail thin and looks like something that might have spent some time, in a Nazi concentration camp. And yet when she stands before the mirror, she sees herself as, as very heavy. Now, what's wrong there? That's hard to answer, right? I don't know that we can answer that, but there's a miscommunication. There's a psychological issue here where she does not perceive herself properly, rightly, or accurately. Now, what's our response to an anorexic? Or what should be our response? Compassion, right? That's the first response. And the second response, if you're a therapist, would be, how can I work with this person to help this person align so that their mind aligns with reality? Okay? And so the approach is we're going to try to help this person deal with their anorexia. Do you see how that is a good analogy for transgenderism? So here you've got, again, let's just say a young woman who stands before the mirror, and I don't know how this would actually work in their mind, but they don't see themselves right. So you have this kind of thinking, I'm trapped in the wrong body. And so our culture doesn't deal with that the way it does with so many other psychological disorders. Okay, and in fact, that's a transphobic statement that I just made, right? To say it's a psychological disorder. That's not how this is addressed by the elites in our culture. But when it comes to something like anorexia, that's exactly how they perceive it. This is a psychological disorder. There's a misalignment between reality and how you perceive your body. And in transgenderism, there's a misalignment between reality, biological, sexual reality, and how you see your body. But instead of taking the approach of number one, compassion, number two, how do we help this person come into alignment so that their mind and their body are in agreement? Instead we say, no, go on cross-sex hormones, mutilate your body, and pretend that biological sex isn't a categorical reality any longer. And one of the reasons we do this is that transgenders commit suicide I think it's about 40%. If you identify transgender, suicide rate is extremely high. But the evidence also suggests that transitioning in so many cases doesn't take away the underlying anxiety that leads to suicide and so forth. So it doesn't seem like that's always a very compassionate response. Anyway, it's a very complicated issue, but I just thought this was a really interesting story and one of the university swimmers' fathers. Okay, so this is not the transgender swimmers. This is the woman swimmer. One of the gals getting beat by biological men in the swim pool. They did quote him briefly, and just you could hear the frustration came across even just reading his words about how this is such a mess, and somehow the NCAA has to figure this out. And at this point, there's not a lot of hope that they're going to. And again, regardless of what you think of transgenderism, I would think that everyone would agree that this is potentially going to destroy women's sports. It just is. And in our culture, if you say anything against it, of course, J.K. Rowling's is the most obvious example. You know who she is, right? The author of the Harry Potter books, just celebrating the 20th anniversary of the movies, of the Harry Potter movies, the first one coming out. And I mean, J.K. Rowling is a massive name in our culture, and yet she has actually taken the position that transgenderism is anti-feminism, and she has been blacklisted by so many of the elites in our culture. And of course, anybody who says that transgenderism is a psychological disorder and should be treated as such is automatically branded as, just sort of beyond the pale. That was in the news this week. Another article, I do have an article here. This is from The World and Everything in It, which is one of the podcasts that I listen to most days, particularly Monday and Friday. If you got to make some choices about podcasts because you just have limited time, The World and Everything in It is really good on Monday and Friday. Because Monday is the Monday Money Beat, and they talk to a financial guy, and he's a really smart guy, and it's just interesting to listen to him. And then Friday, they always have some worldview stuff, and they talk to John Stonestreet, who works for the Colson Center, Chuck Colson's organization. He's kind of took Colson's place when he passed away. And they talk about worldview, and he's a very interesting guy. And so Monday and Friday are the days to really listen to that podcast if you got to make a choice. They were talking. There's two things that came up on January 4th. One of them is just religious liberty. Well, both of them have to do with religious liberty, but the first one has to do with religious liberty and COVID restrictions in Canada. And I decided to read this to you. The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms is what protects freedom of conscience and religion in that country. I assume it's a little bit like our Bill of Rights. What's the first freedom of the United States? Freedom of speech, religious liberty, right? So they have something called the Charter of Rights, which guarantees them religious liberty. That includes the right to gather for worship, to speak, and to live out one's views in public without fear of persecution. I'm skipping down here. They're talking to a lawyer, and this lawyer works for the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms. And this is, I think, a Canadian group. He's certainly defending various churches and pastors in Canada, and counselors as well, as we'll see in a moment. Because this group's dealing with a number of different religious liberty challenges. And so skipping down here, I'll just pick this up. You're defending one church that was fined for conducting a Zoom service with a skeletal crew of a few people to lead the service and to run the sound. What's the latest with that? And of course, this is a verbal interview, right? So it's not as precise as written English. So I'm just going to read it as he spoke it. Yeah, that's exactly it. It's shocking to think that when the church is actually doing what the government has told them to do, conduct virtual services, that they are being fined for doing just that, gathering in a church building 5 or 6 people, a sound tech, and a worship leader. And there have been negotiations with the Crown. Shockingly, they're not backing down. So this isn't just, a slip, oops, we violated religious freedom. This is an intentional effort targeting faith groups that are gathering in exercise of their freedoms. So, and it's sort of province by province in Canada. But if you've been frustrated over COVID restrictions in this country, Canada's a whole different animal. Skipping down again, Marty, what are the pandemic rules and restrictions in Canada right now regarding services? I guess they vary by province. Yes, they absolutely vary province by province. In some cases, like British Columbia that I mentioned, they vary by locations within a province. So the northern British Columbia area, the provincial health officers deem that to be a low vaccination rate, so you can't even go to church unless you're vaccinated in northern British Columbia. In Quebec right now, you are not allowed to go to a house of worship at all. So our neighbors to the north, I think probably many of you are aware of this at some level. Churches still, many of them are shut down. And this situation with a Zoom service where a church is in the crosshairs of the law because they were doing a Zoom service. So I guess that's something to be aware of and maybe pray for them as well. Then the second issue here, which is, I think, more troubling, honestly, and it goes to the LGBTQ plus stuff, which so much does in our country and in Canada as well. And again, in the United States, I always put it this way, it's like, we have liberties in our Constitution. The first one is religious liberty. That's the first freedom of the United States. And it's what you have here is you have religious liberty, that's this fist, and you have erotic liberty, that's this fist, okay? Because the whole LGBTQ plus, it's all wrapped up with erotic liberty, isn't it? With sexual liberty, to do what I want to do with my body, and no one can tell me otherwise. And you've got religious liberty and erotic liberty, like two buses almost, and they continue to hit each other. And every time they hit each other, religious liberty is thrown under the bus. That's the reality of so much of what's going on in our culture. And so you've got Christian colleges who are concerned about student housing, for instance. What about the homosexual couple that get married and they want to have student housing? And can you say no to that? And the Biden administration is pressing very hard to say, no, you can't say no to that. And so that's a religious liberty issue, where you've got people of conscience guided by Scripture who are saying, we cannot, in obedience to Scripture, submit to what the government is trying to force upon us. And by the way, we have something called the Constitution of the United States, and by the way, that Constitution has a First Amendment, which is the first freedom of this country, which guarantees religious liberty. And by the way, the Constitution does not mention LGBTQ plus rights. So that's historically the reality, but when these two come into conflict, it's religious liberty that's losing, often, okay? Again, this is Canada. So it's not the United States, but what happens there, it comes here sometimes as well. So picking this up again, Canada, as I understand it, has passed a broadly worded law banning so-called conversion therapy. What can you tell us about that? So what's conversion therapy? Yeah, now, conversion therapy, as I understand it, and I don't know a lot about it, but I do know that at times it's been primitive and barbaric, okay? There have been things done that should not be done, like electric shock therapy. Someone's struggling with same-sex desires, and so you do electric shock therapy. That's hardly a appropriate response, okay? So let's acknowledge that. But let's acknowledge that medicine throughout the centuries, so much of what has passed for medicine or psychotherapy has been primitive, correct? I mean, how many people died hundreds of years ago from being bled out because they thought that was an appropriate treatment? I mean, the first president might have died from that. So this ban on so-called conversion therapy is the broadest ban enacted in the name of conversion therapy anywhere in the world. It utilizes a definition that is unknown to medicine, unknown to psychologists or counseling association. It really bans the conversations that an individual would even have with his or her own faith leader. And not just a faith leader, okay, a counselor. So in other words, you have someone, you're a practicing counselor or your pastor in Canada, and you have someone who comes to you and says, I'm struggling with same-sex desire. Can you help me? Okay? And in Canada, they're saying you can't have that conversation unless you are going to affirm them in that desire. Okay, I'm going to keep reading. The implications are incredible. It actually directly discriminates against anyone on the LGBTQ spectrum who would be seeking counseling to deal with the issues that they're facing, other than counseling that would affirm and push the ideological agenda advocated in the name of the LGBTQ community. And so this law, passed by unanimous consent through the House and the Senate in Canada, is actually one of the most shocking violations of religious freedom anywhere in the free world, or the so-called free world, which I think is an interesting statement that they just added that. This Canadian lawyer added that, the so-called free world. Because it does kind of feel that way, doesn't it? This is a soft totalitarianism where you're banning an individual from saying something, and even if the person who comes to see you says, I want help with this, you can't help them. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And unfortunately, there's no political will to fight it in Canada, obviously, so it's likely going to end up in the courts as well, which so often these things do. I realize, this is the interviewer, I realize you are a lawyer, not a philosopher, but it's hard not to draw conclusions about the actions of the Canadian government as it views religious faith. Comment. And so the lawyer responds as follows. This is the last thing I'll read. Yeah, well, I mean, religious freedom is a kind of canary in the coal mine, if you will. When it's attacked, let's stop there. What is that? What's the analogy just used? A canary in a coal mine. What's that about? What's that? Yeah, so in the old days, you've seen pictures maybe of miners, and they come out of the mines, and they've got, the coal dust all over their bodies and so forth. And, it's dangerous, dangerous work. And so they would take a canary down into the mine. And if the canary died, the coal miners realized something is wrong here. The air is not safe. We must get out. So that's the analogy that's being used here. Religious freedom is a kind of canary in the coal mine, if you will. When it's attacked, other fundamental freedoms are quickly undermined as well. And your society and our society has lost sight of the value of protecting the practice and expression of religious faith, despite it being, in fact, the first of the fundamental freedoms protected under our charter. But governments continue to trample on religious freedom with generally apathy from the public, and so far near impunity from the courts, at least in regard to COVID. And the Justice Center is fighting to change that. I think people are beginning to realize when you see pastors getting arrested simply for conducting a religious service that harmed absolutely no one, we realize that our society's freedoms are being jeopardized. And again, religious freedom being the canary in the coal mine, that it is non-religious people, I think, are beginning to wake up to the idea, a government can't just discriminate at will against people of faith, and that right needs to be protected. Otherwise, we can risk slipping into the same kind of totalitarianism that has marred much of the world to date. So anyway, that's in the news last week, and any comments? Mm-hmm.
The governor didn't like it, but was pleasantly surprised that they took the stand and is not opposing it.
So that's kind of an example from the American Revolution where I think, was it Franklin who said, we hang together or we'll hang separately.
Exactly.
And there's some truth to that.
The schools will stay open.
Mm-hmm.
They've gotten tired of it, and they're done with it. Big relief, I think,
Yeah.
for many people. Portland's not taking it very well.
Mm-hmm.
Another issue, people don't realize one of the vaccine mandates that the president has issued was towards federal employees, which he probably has a stronger standing on as opposed to
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So anyway, our son is a federal employee. And he works for the dam system, so he's in Washington. And I didn't get it clear, but I think the Washington Supreme Court ruled that the feds cannot blanket, um, what do I want to say, refuse religious exemptions. And our son went on a religious exemption, and so basically they said, no, we have to consider religious exemption. So he's still working when they were supposed to,
Mm-hmm.
he was supposed to not, quit working because he hasn't taken vaccine. He has natural immunity.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of a positive thing, but he said now a bunch of the Corps of Engineers military brass are sitting around trying to figure out how do we handle religious exemptions.
Mm-hmm.
He said, it's gonna be another 6 months. It's just kind of, it illustrates total incompetence of the federal government and how they're dealing with COVID. But it's a good thing because they finally said, no, you can't blanket, say religious exemption is not going to be considered.
Yeah, and I didn't mention, but there were 2 oral arguments for 2 cases for the Supreme Court last week on vaccines and whether the federal government has the power through OSHA to force not just federal employees, but the mandates. What are the details on all this? Might get some of this wrong, but to try to force corporations are going to force all their employees to be vaccinated, and that's gone to the Supreme Court. And I think that the people who are watching that and tracking that realize that what's being discussed is so much bigger than COVID. I'm vaccinated, right? And I've said that repeatedly. I'm not anti-vaccination. I'm pro-vaccination. But the issue becomes, who gives the Biden administration the power to force businesses to serve as agents of the government to require all their employees to be vaccinated? Where's that power come from? And I think I'm hopeful the decision's going to be that the federal government doesn't have that power and that the court actually is going to rule against the government. And then the court will be slammed as being anti-science, as being anti-vaccination, and all the rest. And I think that'll be a terribly mischaracterization of what the court is really responding to. The court is looking forward and they're saying, we have a bureaucratic state that is out of control and has unbelievable power in this country. And that is the real thing here that needs to be reined in. The federal government only has power as granted to them through the Constitution or through Congress. And they're overstepping that power. So, and that's where this idea of soft totalitarianism, which frightens people, and it rightly does. I've mentioned this book several times, but Rod Dreher's book, Live Not by Lies. And in that book, one of the most interesting parts of that book is where he interviews a number of people who've come out of places like Czechoslovakia, what's now the Czech Republic. They've come to the United States out of communism. And these are the people who are saying, do you not see what's happening here, that this is really frightening? I really do believe, I said this to my wife the other day, I believe that I have fewer freedoms today than I did 25 years ago. I really do believe that this nation is a less free nation than it was 25 years ago. I have less freedom to think and to say what I really believe. And let's face it, I have a lot more freedom than a lot of you do because I don't have a secular employer who's mandating that I not say this or that, or I have to use this pronoun or that pronoun. So I think that's a big issue in the Supreme Court that I think is really worth watching and has very little to do, in my mind, with vaccination or non-vaccination. It has to do with something much bigger than that. what is the role of the federal government, and when do they step beyond the authority that has been granted to them? Okay, I think we should get on though with today's lesson, or we're not going to, because I do want to make some progress with this. So I'm going to shut this down, if that's all right. So we're talking about origins, creation by design, or cosmic accident. Last week, we spent a lot of time looking at what I called the presuppositional approach, which is, and worldviews are based on presuppositions. So presupposition number 1 was the God of the Bible exists, and presupposition number 2 is there is no God. And what we considered is just what's the fallout of that? If you try to live out of one of these assumed truths, that's what a presupposition is. It's an assumed truth. I don't prove this. I assume this is true. So if I assume the God of the Bible exists, well, again, the fill-ins, the world has purpose. I have purpose. There's something called objective truth, or what Francis Schaeffer called true truth. There are things that are really right and things that are really wrong, because there's a lawgiver outside of me and above me, and that's God. And if you don't have that as a presupposition, then again, what I said last Sunday is it's very hard to say that Adolf Hitler was wrong. You see why it's so hard to say Adolf Hitler was wrong? Because who is Adolf Hitler? A human being, a powerful one, but who am I? A human being, and a less powerful one. So it's one human being telling another human being right from wrong. You see the problem with that. You need someone outside and above who says, thou shalt not murder. Okay? So that's objective truth, or including right and wrong, including ethics. And then suffering is transformative. We talked about that quite a bit. It's a weak point to theism. Oftentimes, the atheist will say, well, what about suffering? You say you've got a God and this God is good, and you say you've got a God and this God is sovereign, but there's so much suffering in the world. So this is the Achilles heel of your viewpoint, and there is an issue there that you have to try to deal with. But if you think it from the other perspective, if you're an atheist and you get cancer, what do you have? You have cancer and no hope, right? So the idea that suffering is transformative, I might not understand it. I might not know what God is doing here, but I believe God is doing something. And I am in God's hands, and there is a future called glory. And so all of a sudden, suffering can have meaning and significance. So really, suffering is a problem for everybody, but it's a bigger problem, I think, for the atheist, because there is no hope when they go to the doctor and the doctor says, it's cancer, it's terminal, you're going to be dead in 6 months. Okay? So, presupposition number 2, then, the world is a cosmic accident. Again, this is if you're an atheist. This is the worldview. This is where it leads. The world is a cosmic accident. There is no purpose. There's no foundation for ethics. Suffering is meaningless. And we talked about how hard it is to live in that world, isn't it? You look at suicide rates in the United States, and I have to think there's got to be some connection here. If you're telling young people that, life is an accident, there is no purpose, there's no right and wrong, and it's all meaningless, it's really hard to get up every morning and pull your pants on and do life under that worldview. Okay, so now we're up to the present. Creation ex nihilo. Do you have that in your notes? Because my notes are, I give you less notes than I've got, so I can say something that you don't have. Okay? The Latin phrase ex nihilo, that phrase means out of nothing. So this is the biblical perspective of creation. God created the world, God created the universe out of nothing. This means that before God began to create the universe, nothing else existed except God himself. Okay? But who is this God that exists before nothing else? What's the theological term we use for this? Anybody? Starts with a T. I thought that would help. Trinity. Yes. So this is a sort of a little bit of a rabbit trail, but just to remind you that God, the triune God, the God who's existed for all of eternity, has never been, fill in the blank. Created, yes. Lonely. God's never been lonely because God's never been alone. Okay? So we have this thing called the relational Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, which is a perfect relationship at the center of all things and before all things. And that's helpful for us at several points. One way it's helpful for us is to recognize that, and I've said this before and I've heard this before, God created us because he needed some fellowship. Okay, whenever you use the word needed in reference to God, that should be a red light that goes off in your mind. Be extremely careful to suggest that God in any sense is needy, or that God could even be needy. Because when you think of neediness, what does that suggest in your mind? Yeah, there's something lacking. God isn't sufficient. God isn't enough. And so the answer to this idea that God created us because he wanted some fellowship is really bad theology. That's unbiblical theology. Because the Bible expresses the sufficiency of God. And so before everything else, there's God, but he's in this relationship of one God, three persons, and it's a perfect relationship of love, and it's also an ordered relationship. The theological term for this is there's a taxis within the Trinity. And the way to state this is that God is the three persons of God, Father, Son, and Spirit, are co-eternal and co-equal, even though there are role relationships within the Trinity. Within the Trinity, the Father is Father and the Son is Son. The Father will never be the Son, and the Son will never be the Father. And in that relationship, the Father leads and initiates. It's the Father who sends the Son, okay? So the whole idea of how there can be equality but distinction is rooted within the Trinity. And so the Trinity becomes the model for all of our own relationships. So there's a lot of profound stuff here, but let's end that rabbit trail because it is a rabbit trail, okay? So Aristotle's 6 causes. Aristotle lived about 400 years before the birth of Christ. Have you ever heard of Aristotle's 6 causes? I'd be a little surprised if you had. This is interesting. It's sort of a thought game of sorts. But when we're through this, I hope I can bring it back to origins and make a point here that will stick. So Aristotle talked about what is required for something to be created. Okay? And he's a thinker. And so he makes fine distinctions. And so he has these 6 causes: the material cause, the formal cause, the final cause, the instrumental cause, the efficient cause, and the sufficient cause. Okay? And I've given you a definition for each of those. And so the material cause is that out of which something is made. And then I've given you an example. So think of a sculpt. A piece of, what am I trying to say? A statue. Okay? So the goal here is to make a statue. So the material cause, that out of which something is made. What would the material cause be in this example? The stone. Yeah. Maybe marble. Okay? So you have a material something that you start with in order to create the statue. Now, from a biblical worldview, do we have a material cause? No. Right? We don't. This creation ex nihilo is that God created the universe out of nothing. Now that's a head scratcher, isn't it? Can you even begin to wrap your mind around that concept? How is it that God creates the universe out of nothing? It'd be like a sculptor creating Michelangelo's David, but he didn't have a stone with which to begin the work. Okay? That makes sense? You understand what I'm saying. Okay? The formal cause. The formal cause is the design or idea followed in the process of making something. So what might that be? Let's say we're building a house. The design or idea followed in the process of making something. The blueprint, yeah. You go to an architect, you have some plans drawn up, and you call that a blueprint. And if you're making a sculpture, it might be just something you pencil out on paper, a drawing showing what you're going to produce. But some kind of a sketch. The fill-in is a sketch made by the sculpture as a pattern for the sculpture. What's that? Yes. Okay, then the next one here, we'll come back to this, but let me just introduce all these. The final cause, the purpose for which something is made. The purpose for which something is made. What might be the fill-in here? The reason. That's right. The reason why the sculpture is doing the sculpture. And what might be the reason? A commission would probably be the most likely one. It could be just a love of doing the artwork, but probably it's a commission. Some ruler in the ancient world, some ruler has commissioned you to do a sculpture of himself, or perhaps his grandfather or some other famous individual. Or if you go to the United Center in Chicago, you can see Michael Jordan permanently there. Well, not permanently, but he's there he's cast, right? There's a statue of him outside the building. And that's to honor his, basketball prowess. So there's a reason for this. The instrumental cause, the means or instrument by which something is made. So again, with the sculpture, what would that be? Chisel, right? The tools. Could be a chisel, a hammer, but the tools that he uses to do the work. The efficient cause, the chief agent causing something to be made. Now, in our example, who's that? What's that? The sculpture. The sculptor, the artist. The person who's actually doing the work. And let's face it, what does that person have to have? What? Talent, right? You got to have the right stuff. No one's going to commission me to do a famous sculpture of President Trump or President Biden, either one, right? Because it would be hideous. Because I do not have the right stuff to do that. You read about great artists and someone like Michelangelo, and you read statements like, they saw the block of stone and they could see the finished work. And they just needed to free it from the stone. They could see it in the mind's eye, and they had the skill to bring it about. So you got to have the right stuff. And then finally, the sufficient cause, which is defined this way: a cause equal to the task of causing the thing to be made. And this one's a little more vague, I think. Sufficient cause, I think I actually was getting into this with what I said a moment ago. It's a person capable of sculpting. Yeah, a person who has, so you got to have more than just a person. Not just any person will do. You've got to have the right person, the person who has the ability, who's equal to the task. Okay, so now I want to take this and apply this for a moment to the whole question of origins. And so when we look at this, we've already talked about the material cause and how for theism, that's a bit of a problem for us, isn't it? Because the Bible says God created the universe out of nothing. And so there's no material cause that God begins with. He's not just rearranging pre-existing material, right? You want to say something, Dan?
Well, a question. The idea out of nothing, where does that come from? Because it just says that God, it says, in the beginning God created. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So that, where does this, I mean, and I'm not disagreeing with the out of nothing. It's just, sometimes it has to do with how we perceive it.
The verse that, the verse that probably, the Hebrews 11:3 verse is probably the best verse in the Bible to try to answer your question. And it reads this way: by faith we understand that the universe was created by the Word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of things that are visible. Okay? Now you got to interpret what that means, but it seems to be suggesting that there's a lot of things in the universe that are visible. We see these things, these are real. They were made by God, but they were made out of things that are not made out of things that are visible. So I mean that's pretty close to that idea.
Right, but in a sense, it's probably not nothing, right? I mean, whether you say, God possessed the energy or whatever it is, you know what I mean? In my mind, it has to do with how humans perceive it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you could use the same sort of thinking through on germs and cellular structure, because at one point people would say, what's a germ? I can't see it. It is so small.
So Dan, are you saying? But I'm curious about this. No, this is interesting. I'm not.
No, but I mean, we can push, I think sometimes we push this out of nothing maybe further than it needs to be pushed.
Mm-hmm.
I agree with that statement. It was
Mm-hmm.
created out of, from the Bible's
Yeah.
perspective, right? Written to people who are, caravanning and living in tents, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, created out of nothing. And I affirm that statement. But does that mean that it was actually, there's a vacuum there? You see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
From what we know about physics and all that stuff? I mean,
At some point there had to be nothing, though.
Well, but there's always something, and that's God Himself.
there's God. There's
So
God.
so are you saying like God infused within creation something of His own energy, or?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
God uses something.
That's highly philosophical.
Sure.
Yeah. But by the way, be careful of chronological snobbery. As if those people walking around in caravans, that's a big problem in our culture today, the chronological snobbery. We got to tear down all these statues, because if we'd been back there, we would have done better than those people did. That's what I'm getting at.
And people, 2,000 years from now, may look at us and see the same thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just, I sometimes wonder how, I affirm it was created out of nothing, but
Mm-hmm.
how important is that to push?
Mm-hmm.
How far do you push that point? Because if God was there, and He made, whether it was
Yeah.
energy that,
Well, and I think what I'm about to say is kind of going in the direction that you're thinking, perhaps. So let me say it. Why I've taken the time to introduce you to Aristotle's 6 causes, this is the most exciting thing that's happened in weeks, right? I mean, you're sitting here thinking, I'm just dumbfounded by this insight. But there is something to be said here, because what we're dealing with right now is presuppositions, which is assumed starting points. Okay, so presupposition 1 is the God of the Bible exists. Presupposition 2 is there is no God. And I want to now run this there is no God through these 6 causes. Okay, but before that, let's think about there is a God. Formal cause. Formal cause. Now we're thinking about the universe. God has made the universe. Formal cause. What's that formal cause? Did God have a blueprint? Yes. Where's the blueprint? In God's mind. Okay, there's a formal cause. A final cause, the reason for creating the universe. Does God have a reason for what He's done? Is there a purpose? And what is that purpose? Okay. What's the Westminster Catechism? The first question. What is the chief end of man? To glorify God and enjoy Him forever. Okay, so you could, what Marilyn said is right too, right? There's different answers for this that are right answers. But the point being, there is a reason. There's a purpose. Okay, the instrumental cause, the sculpture's chisel for making the statue. What's the instrumental cause when it comes to God? The power of divine speech. And God said, let there be light. Or in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. And then John tells us that this Word, this Logos, creates the universe and sustains it. Okay? So in another sense, the means by which God creates is the Word and the Spirit. Okay? An efficient cause. Is there an efficient cause? There's God. Right? Is there a sufficient cause? A person who has the power to accomplish this. Okay? So in Aristotle's 6 causes, when you run theism through these, 5 of these, it's very apparent. And we do have the question mark in the material cause, and that's where, like, what does, when you go back to the verse I read in Ephesians chapter 11, let me read that again. The second word, by faith, we understand the universe was created by the Word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of things that are visible. The second word does matter, right? Faith does come into this, because it goes beyond our minds how God could create ex nihilo. Okay? But, go ahead.
There is different theological approach to the ex nihilo term because there was some theologians that believe that God created the world in 6 days, 6 literal days.
Mm-hmm.
But some others believe it's not 6 literal days, but it's just a way to say
It's epics of time.
millions of years.
Mm-hmm.
But the people that have that theology or ideology about the ex nihilo, that God created the world in billion years, I think that defeat the ex nihilo ideology.
Mm-hmm.
Because if God took millions of years to create everything, that means He followed a process using different material through that process to create the world.
Mm-hmm.
If the millions of years is true, so that will defeated the ex nihilo idea, because if it's that created the world in a lapse of time, so that means it
Mm-hmm.
goes through a process, and if it goes through a process, that means He used different material for everything to be. So, what will be your position regarding that?
My position is, that's a rabbit trail. Can we come back to that? That is an important issue, and I don't want to totally dodge it, but I'm going to dodge it in the interest of time. I'm just going to say this, that regardless of which view you take, young earth, old earth, in both camps, they both acknowledge ex nihilo. So even the ones who say it's a billions of years old earth, they still affirm that God created from nothing. It's like God created the heavens and the earth, and then He took billions of years to work with that to form it as it is now. Okay? But thank you for your comments. Okay? Maybe we'll get back to that here in a couple of weeks, because I've left some room for questions at the end of this.
I have a concern because it kind of implied, there was an implication that back in biblical times, people didn't understand atoms and the makeup of matter, and therefore they couldn't understand how God created. That is wrong, because you have to equate
Yeah, I mean, the doctrine of creation ex nihilo is that God did not take pre-existing matter and reshape it. God created matter energy. Okay, but I'm trying to get to the point of all of this, okay? And I did start it, that's right. But I want you to just take a moment with me and run these 6 causes through proposition number 2, or presupposition number 2, there is no God. Okay, that's the dominant worldview of the elites in our culture today. There is no God. Or some form of agnosticism, or maybe some form of spiritualism, but there is the God of the Bible, no way. Okay, so where does that lead you? Is there material cause? No. If there was ever a time when there was nothing, absolutely nothing, what would there be right now? Nothing. Okay? Where'd the Big Bang come from? I mean, that singularity, where'd it come from? They don't have an answer for this. Okay? Is there a formal cause, a blueprint, a sketch? No. If you're an atheist, if there is no God. So is there any purpose? The final cause, is there a reason for all of this? No. Is there an instrumental cause, like a tool, God's spoken word? No. Is there an efficient cause, like a creator? Is there a sufficient cause, a person with the power to actually do what we see all around us? So the point I'm trying to make, and I hope it's worth making, because I've labored at it and we've had an interesting discussion, is that presupposition number 1, the God of the Bible exists. When you take this through Aristotle's causes, 5 of them make sense completely. But when you go to the view of atheism, there is no God, none of Aristotle's causes make any sense. Okay? Here's the point. I, for one, am sick and tired of being told that I'm a person of faith and the other side are all people of science. And they mean by that we're thinkers and you're a fool. The point I'm trying to make is that regardless of where you start with either of these presuppositions, at some point you're living by faith. Because you can't prove this stuff. But when you do something like we've done today, which one of these presuppositions makes the most sense? Which seems the most logical? I think it's not even a contest. I think this is like the God of the Bible just crushed his opponent. Because if you're living from that worldview, again, what we looked at last Sunday, you're living in a world without purpose, without meaning, without significance, an absolute cosmic accident. And that's a hard world to live in. Okay? Let me close today. Go back to page 1, because Barbara pointed out to me that there's something that I'd passed over. And this would be a good time to just touch on that. Middle of the page probably. God is a blank, not a blank. It's not spirit. He is a spirit, that's true. God is a cause, not an effect. Every effect has a cause, right? I mean, if I drop this piece of paper right now, that's an effect. The paper falls. There was a cause of that, wasn't there? So every effect has a cause, but God is an uncaused cause. Okay? There's nothing logically contradictory to that. So God is a power of being or existence eternally within himself. This means that he is awesome beyond the ability of our minds to comprehend. Every created thing is an effect. That's important. Every created thing is an effect. Our minds are wired this way, right? We want to know the cause and effect. Our minds think in this way. Every created thing is an effect, having been caused by something or someone else. God is the uncaused cause of all things. So the little boy says to his buddy, "Who created the world?" And his buddy goes to Sunday school, and so he says, "God did." And then the little boy says, "Who created God?" And the other little theologian says, "Well, that's easy. God created himself." No. You got to get out of that way of thinking. God is not an effect. God is a cause. He's an eternal cause, a self-existent cause. He's an uncaused cause. And there's nothing contradictory in the concept of an eternal, uncaused being. Although, let's face it, it blows our minds away to even contemplate that, doesn't it? All right, we got to close. I hope this has been somewhat helpful. I realize it's been kind of up here today. But I hope you do take away from this that, theism is a Christian worldview, has a lot to say for it and a lot going for it. And frankly, I think it takes more faith. If you think through what we've looked at today, it takes more faith to be an atheist than it does to be a Christian. Because in all the things we've been considering the last several weeks, theism is so much more compelling than the other view is. And I just think it's ironic that in our culture, we're just dismissed as non-thinkers. And in reality, the other view, they're like a person standing on a platform, and the platform's been pulled out from underneath them, and they're up in midair, and they don't even know it. They've got nothing to stand upon. So anyway, someone want to close in prayer?